Welcome back. As we continue with our next panel of witnesses on the draft climate change plan, this panel will be focusing on the policies and proposals in the draft bit on the waste sector. I welcome to the meeting Gary Walker, the Head of Specialist Regulations from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, Duncan Simpson, the Member of the Management Committee for Resources Management Association Scotland, Kim Pratt, the Senior Circular Economy Campaigner for Friends of the Earth. Online, Dr. Lucy Wishart, the Lecturer in Circular Economy and Sustainable Transformations for the University of Edinburgh, and Ian Gilland, until very recently, I think I've got this right, the Chief Executive of Zero Waste Scotland. I don't know what happened after recently, but you can tell us at some stage afterwards, no doubt. Thank you very much for attending this morning. As is normally the way, I get to ask the simple questions at the beginning just to make you all at ease. Looking at the figures, the waste sector's emissions fell sharply till about 2013 and then effectively stalled. And I can't understand the barriers why. So, Gary, do you want to explain to me why the barriers on why further reductions aren't possible and why they stalled? Sorry, this is quite a hard one to ask. That's probably...
No, not really. No,
okay.
no. So the figures I have suggest that actually emissions in 2023 were 73% lower than they were back in 1990. So it's just an indication that there has been significant progress. Also, landfill figures, landfilling 19% of our waste compared to more than 90% of our waste back in the 1990s as well. So there's evidence of progress, I think. However, we do all recognise that our endeavours to reduce waste, to prevent waste, to reuse and to recycle have plateaued, and the recycling figures have plateaued in recent times. And we welcome the fact that the climate change plan, aligned with the route map and the circular economy strategy, focuses on the top of the waste hierarchy and unlocking further progress in terms of reduction, waste reuse and prevention. So for me, the figures, yes, slightly frustrating that we've kind of plateaued in terms of recycling figures, but there is progress on emissions reductions and further progress certainly achievable in terms of the shift away from landfill as well.
Okay, Duncan, do you want to comment on the stalling and, you know, is it down to people doing more or is it down to governments doing more? What have we got to do?
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, first of all, and I would agree with much of what Gary said, but I think the important point to emphasise again is that we've kind of picked off some of the low-hanging fruit. I think it's also correct to say that just solely focusing on recycling isn't the right thing to do, and I know that you all know that. But to try to persuade consumers, as we've heard, because we sat through the transport section of this, to change their consumption habits, to try to rethink some of the purchases that they may make, and also to try to get the supply chain that delivers those goods to those consumers to change their behaviour, is a long-term activity. And there has been a lot of work and investment done in that area. And some of the good points within the plan are the work around procurement, so using procurement as a lever to say there is a good standard for recycled content aggregate, which many of my members make and make available to the industry. But as a buyer, you're probably taking more risk in a recycled aggregate in their mind than you are from taking a clean stone out of a quarry. It may be that there are more policy thoughts around how you incentivise people and reward them for making those consumption and production changes. So if it's more expensive to buy the more environmentally sound product, then why would you do it? And I think we also are taking a lot more time now to try to construct more complex legislation, so the extended producer responsibility legislation. But when you start to encapsulate that cost within the cost of a packed product, it's a longer-term communication with that company to say, and if you designed it differently, it may cost you less. It may be easier for the consumer to make it last longer. It may be easy to deconstruct, repair, refurbish and put onto the market. So I think we've made a lot of progress in a short space of time. We have had a stall, and there is more that's been happening in the background, but we need to try to invest more in those areas to get that change to happen at scale.
Okay, Kim, when I come to you, perhaps you could maybe comment also on whether you think the overall impressions of the waste emission pathway within the plan is going to deliver, and that we've set the right, or the government set the right ambitions within the plan.
Yes, of course. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to the committee today. I've been working on waste policy in Scotland for the past 15 years, and I most recently spoke to the committee about the Circular Economy Bill. Firstly, in terms of the first question, in terms of progress, what we are seeing in the waste sector is in fact not as big a reduction as what the figures show. So we're actually seeing a transfer in emissions from the waste chapter to the energy chapter, and that's because the biggest change in waste management in Scotland over the last few decades has been a move from landfilling our waste to incinerating it instead, and incineration is covered in a different chapter of the Circular Economy Plan. So what we're seeing is actually less progress than what it looks like in the chapter. And that is down to poor carbon accounting, really. And I think one of the main points that I want to get across to the committee today is that poor carbon accounting has led to poor policy making for the waste sector in Scotland. And what we really need to see is, alongside the way that we account for emissions in Scotland, which is done on a territorial basis, so the emissions that are generated in Scotland, we really need to see a more consumption-based approach to considering our emissions. So that involves thinking about the emissions of these materials wherever they come from. And that's particularly important for waste and materials, because 50% of the materials that we use in Scotland are imported, and we use about 100 million tonnes of materials every year. So it's very important for policymakers to see the whole picture of what they need to reduce. If they're only focusing on waste, then that's about 10% of our material use by weight. So there's a whole 90% of materials which are a black box for policymakers, and it's impossible then for them to really make the right changes and drive the changes that we need to see in Scotland. And that's part of the reason why we've also seen this stalling of emissions reduction. So it's down to a failure to deliver the right policies. And we've seen failures around the need to reduce food waste. We've actually seen an increase in the amount of food waste in Scotland. And of course, we've seen an increase in incineration as well because of this poor carbon accounting. So we really need the committee to consider how do we bring in these consumption emissions reportings so that it can really help policymakers to make the right changes and drive change up the waste hierarchy.
And I understand your aspirations on that, but we're looking at a plan that's been put to us by the government to see whether it meets the aspirations of Scotland to reach net zero by 2045. So we'll certainly bear that in mind. Ian, do you want to answer the question? We've plateaued, we're not going any further. And do you think the pathway in the climate change plan is sufficient?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. So just caveat, as you said, I have very recently just moved out of Zero Waste Scotland on the 31st of December, so very recent. So forgive me, I do feel a little bit still in transition. So I'm not obviously here to speak on behalf of Zero Waste Scotland, because that's not my employ.
And I would put on the record that we understand that, but you have a huge knowledge of this sector, and we're very grateful that although you've taken a step back, as it were, that you'll bring that knowledge gained from years of involvement in the sector. So we understand you're not speaking on behalf of Zero Waste Scotland.
But forgive me if I do slip into use the wee word or something like that. It has been.
We'll quote you.
As I said, yeah. I mean, we'll scratch that from the record. So anyway, I think. I mean, I do agree with what's been said from all of the participants. But I guess I do think we're in a moment of time in terms of this policy area. So, having been involved in Zero Waste Scotland, we have been, to some extent, staring at this for the last couple of years. And I've been in this very room talking about this, acknowledging the plateauing, as you've said, of recycling rates, etc., and ambitions around thinking differently about the carbon and the climate and all of that. But also more broadly the circular economy and what that means for our economy in terms of building more resilient supply chains of materials and actually reducing our consumption, our overall consumption of resources, not just here in Scotland, but from a global perspective, as Kim had showed. So we've been really... So I do think we're in a different place because there are plans. We do have a circular economy route map in play as we speak. We have a circular economy bill. It was passed by the Parliament unanimously. There's a circular economy strategy that's out for consultation now. All of those ambitions that I think that Kim has mentioned are all very much in play from government policy making, and that's the future direction of travel, recognising we do need to go at this, particularly with a different lens, both a carbon lens, but probably more importantly an economic lens, hence the focus on the circular economy. So I do think we're in a much better place than we have been because we now do understand the complexity of all of this. And I echo, I think what others have said, that perhaps we've done some of the easy, the easy fruit, picking the easy fruit, so to speak, and we now recognise that a lot of the areas that we need to get into are going to be more complex. But we need to embrace that complexity. I think that's the real challenge. I think instead of just talking about it being a complex thing, we need to embrace it, we need to understand it's complex, and we need to start thinking, through a systems lens, that we need to involve not just the waste management part of this, we need to think about the design of the products, the utilisation of those, the deployment of those, the procurement of those, how we as consumers and businesses use these products and materials through the whole life cycle, and have that much more of a product stewardship approach to this, which again is very much a focal point of the proposed circular economy strategy. So we're not just thinking about it from a waste management point of view. I think that ultimately the way that the carbon climate change plan is set out, it is about waste management. It's about what happens at the end of pipe in terms of landfill particularly, and how do we reduce that. So I guess whilst there is acknowledgement throughout the plan, the circular economy is mentioned, there's stuff in there about consumption and production and the responsibility of all of us in that space. So all of that, and I'm sure I've been in this room before over the years, asking for those things to be acknowledged, that we need to have a different approach rather than just think about it at the end of pipe. They're in there, but we need to do more. But ultimately, yeah, there's a point there around we've shifted a lot of material out of landfill into another disposal option, energy from waste, and the plan itself acknowledges that, but acknowledges that that's going to increase. The carbon emissions from energy from waste is going to increase because we're moving even more stuff, and there's more stuff in the pipeline. I'm sure we'll get onto the landfill ban implications into energy from waste. So we're going to see increased carbon emissions in that space, but the plan doesn't really talk about what we're going to do about it, other than we're going to deliver all of this other range of policy making about reducing waste without really thinking through that we need to reduce ultimately what we're disposing of and tackle the carbon intensive materials that are in our waste stream in a different way than simply just thinking about it from a collection point of view.
Okay, Lucy, do you want to come in on that?
Sure, I think I'm probably just going to reiterate a lot of what has been said before. One thing that hasn't been said before, I think, though, is that it's not just Scotland that is facing this sort of levelling out of big ambitions. or big shifts, if you like, in terms of how our waste is managed. There's a lot of conversations around the circular economy about that we've reached the low-hanging fruit of things that can be achieved through technical changes, but it's the social changes and the real sort of transformational aspect of it that are going to deliver the additional figures. And just really following on what Ian was saying there, and also, in fact, I think everybody said it, it's about looking upstream now, not just looking at waste management, and thinking about what are the transformational changes about how we interact with our resources. And often that's actually about moving beyond thinking as people as consumers or producers, but thinking about people as users of resources, trying to use different language where we see our resources as a collective responsibility rather than individual things that we deal with as and when we need as businesses or as individual households. And that shift is the only way really that we're going to achieve the carbon reduction targets that we're looking for within Scotland.
Okay, just going on to my pet subject, which is figures, which won't surprise you. If you look at chapter or Annex 3, page 45, it gives the figures for the climate change plan cost. And every year it appears that the costs of or the benefits outweigh the costs of doing it, of doing anything, which is interesting. In the first period, 26 to 30, the net costs are 89.9 million, and that includes the costs of a deposit return scheme. We kind of know those figures perhaps are not quite in line with what the industry thinks it costs. So are you happy that the costs are reasonable, the net climate change costs for the waste management plan, or is it just that the costs are less because the costs are being hidden in the waste management or the burning of waste? It seems to me what you've said, I don't have any confidence in the figures. Ian, you will have looked at this and would have huge confidence in them, surely. Do you want to start us off?
Well, I get the detailed question. So again, I guess I'm putting my hands up and I'm not absolutely clear about the modelling that has been used. And you're right, that point was probably the point I was going to stand at. I mean, that point is based on the landfill, taking material out of landfill, biodegradable material and stuff like that. But does it include exactly the costs of the stuff that's going into energy from waste and the impact of that? I don't know. I don't know the quick answer to that. Because the two things are in two different chapters. So my reading of it was that's the chapter on waste. But yeah, so I'm not sure when I say we, Zero Waste Scotland, has modelled specifically those costs. But we know that we've modelled specific policy instruments that are either in play currently or being delivered through, impact assessments. And yeah, quite often it is a truism that the costs of implementing them, there is a cost implementing them, but the benefits outweigh that cost over the long period of time. And that is obviously a challenge because you still need to invest in infrastructure or new technology or behavioural change campaigns, whatever it is, to get people to shift their behaviour or to adopt new systems, whether that's in the public sector, the household sector or the private sector. But over the time, ultimately waste is a cost. It costs everyone, it costs us all money, whether it's through taxation or private industry, and it's going to increase. I mean, that's, if we get into what's ahead in terms of legislation and policy, not just at Scottish level, but UK level, looking at the global challenges around material extraction and accessibility, particularly around critical raw materials, prices are going to go up. So the prices are going to increase. So the cost, so what what we're trying to do is actually reduce the impact of those costs over the long period. I mean, that's probably not the function of this discussion because it's all about carbon, but that's a reality. And I think we're trying to sometimes ignore that the costs are, for good reason, are going to increase because we're now going to think about the environmental harm and the social harm of some of these practices that we have in terms of the wasteful, the throwaway society that we live in, and we're now going to have to correct that, and that's going to cost money, and we need to do something about it. So investing in this transition now is the thing to do, rather than bear the brunt of those costs going forward and the impact that that's going to have, not just on us individuals, local authorities, I'm sure we'll get into that, but our wider economy. If we continue the way that we're doing, that we think we can just take stuff, we can use it and we can dispose of it, and that's going to cost us a hell of a lot of money.
And I think we heard in the last group about changing attitudes about getting people to buy into the plan and understand what the costs are and what the benefits are. And that's what I'm trying to drill down into, because I'm struggling to understand it. Kim, you're probably happy with the costs are exactly right within page, whatever it is. I said 45 of Annex 3. Are you happy the costs are right?
Well, actually, I think I would agree with Ian on this one. There's a lack of detail here, and clearly some assumptions are being made, and those are not very clear. So, no, I'm not happy with the costs as they're laid out. And I would also agree with Ian around this idea that there is a cost to inaction, which is not being measured here either. So if we do not act, we will see climate change worsen, we will see increases in pollution. And I'd like to pick up on one area in particular. So plastics. Plastics are not mentioned at all in the circular economy strategy for Scotland, and they are hardly mentioned in the climate change plan either. There is a huge health impact related to plastics. So a report last year showed that on a global scale, the health damages being done due to plastics already is costing $1.5 trillion per year. And that will scale down to Scotland as well. So there are huge costs around plastics. And in terms of health impacts, these impacts relate to two main things. So the microplastics that all plastics will break down to eventually. They become so small that they can enter our bodies. And then
Kim, I understand, and I understand your enthusiasm for the subject. So let me ask you the question on plastics, and you're saying there's a huge cost. So if they have been considered, would you expect to see the benefit side of the equation be reduced or increased as a result of not having the plastics in? Are you confident that whatever it is, £1.3 billion in the first period of benefits includes the costs of not having plastics, so much plastics in the economy, or do you think that that's just been ignored?
I don't see that it has been included, okay. And the lack of consideration of plastics in general makes me doubt that it is in there.
Okay. I'm sorry, we are short of time, and I understand plastics are really important. And Ian's told us, and Zero Waste Scotland, and when we did the circular economy, we were given quite a good insight into how important they are. So I'm going to cut you off there, because I want to bring the other witnesses in on this specific subject before I move to other questions from the committee. Duncan, are you happy with the facts and figures, or the costs and benefits?
I think the problem with some of the calculations is where do you draw the boundary to make the calculation in the first instance, and an assumption that a lot of very good things happen at the back end of it. So an example I would give is that I know we've heard comment on that we've moved from landfill towards another form of disposal, but what we did was we've moved one step up the waste hierarchy, because if you don't have landfill in Scotland, waste has to go somewhere, and with the best will in the world, in 2-3 years, we're not going to go from the tonnage we produce as waste or recycling or reuse to zero. So we do have to have a transitional plan to get there, and energy from waste is quite an elegant solution to have if it's well managed, well run, well maintained, but I would also add if it was well networked into the system to provide electricity and free heat and power to the local community. That has a reduction in its own right. It doesn't take away from the fact that going forward, those facilities are going to have to cope with the UK ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme. It kicks in next year in terms of reporting, but those plants will receive a penalty cost for all high carbon materials going into them, which will be plastic, which will be textiles, which will be anything that has a high carbon 14 number on it. And what we need to be doing just now is all of the work that we should have also done around DRS, that we should have been doing around some of these other policies where we're quite good at designing the push out of material. But to me, the winner of DRS, and I don't necessarily put my cards on the table, I don't necessarily 100% agree with it. I think we're already collecting 3.5 out of 4 of the bottles we consume, so it's an expensive way to collect the next half. The prize of DRS would have been to have the PET plant factory that recovers, recycles, creates the recycled polymer, go back into the bottles, which then go back into the manufacturer's recycled content in Scotland. And those jobs, and that technology, that innovation here. I would love to see that, and RMAS members would love to see that.
You're drifting away from my original question, is that are you happy with the figures that are in there?
Overall, I think there is a benefit to move up the chain, but the cost will be paid by us.
Okay. Gary.
Yeah, thank you, Convener.
I'm not sure you mean that, but...
No, I do. Like Ian and his former colleagues in Zero Waste Scotland, we're not party to the detail and the modelling that sits behind the figures. We've not gone into those in any detail, but I think it is a truism that the true costs of waste management we aren't actually paying those at the moment. There is a cost associated with the shift further up the waste hierarchy, and realising the kind of true value and the embedded value in the products and goods that we consume. There is a cost associated with that, and there is a cost associated with the shift. So, although I can't challenge the figures, I do think that in the longer term, the benefits, not just in carbon terms, but in terms of the material value and the wider benefits to society, will be realised in the longer term. I think one example that might be helpful to kind of illustrate is the recent changes to the packaging producer responsibility regime back in 2025, only last week. As a result of those changes, Scottish local authorities have received, and this is not something they've received in the past, £160 million of payments from the producers of packaging waste as a result of the reforms to that scheme. So local authorities received at the tail end of last year £160 million, and that is a system that will continue going forward as well. So you start to see some of the benefits being delivered back into the system and the providers of services.
Be interesting to see where they spent it. Lucy, do you want to add anything on that question?
About the reliability of the figures. I think I've been around in this area for long enough, again, like him for 15 years, to be pretty sceptical of any figures really that are raised in terms of costs and benefits for waste management, because as a sector, it's really struggled with data and getting data. And that's not to say that the waste management sector hasn't made great bounds in getting that data, but they also require data from other sources, and that's not readily available. One of the things I would pick up on is the point of specificity. It doesn't tell us where these costs lie and where these benefits lie. And I think what we've seen with the deposit return scheme thus far is that certain groups within society feel that the costs are overburdened on them and they are not supported with bearing those costs. And so really having more details in line with the aspirations of a just transition about where these costs are going to lie and where the benefits are going to come from, or where the benefits are going to go, is really important. So having a breakdown of those details and a breakdown of those figures in more detail, I think, as well as having the methodology behind the figures, is also needed.
Okay. I think the figures in the climate change plan were suggesting 89.9 in the first period of 4 years, but that was based on the deposit return scheme at 2023 prices, which seems wildly out of date, but there we go. We'll probably leave deposit return scheme, or I will, and I'm going to move straight to Mark with his next questions.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I'm interested in the panel's view on the circular economy strategy and how that links in with the climate change plan. I mean, is there a consistency there? Are there things which don't quite read across between the two? And I'm interested also in your brief comments about the circular economy strategy, So I know there's a focus there on, sector-specific roadmaps. Is that something that you welcome? Are there other things that you feel are ambitious, too ambitious, unambitious? So a couple of points from each of you, if you don't mind. Who'd like to go first? Kim, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can go. Thanks for the question. So I am concerned about the link between these two documents. So the circular economy strategy is not a quantified document, so all the policies in there, we do not know how much impact or benefits there's going to be from each of those policies. And the climate change plan is very reliant on the circular economy strategy and the waste route map as well. So there's a lack of accountability there between the two documents. And I think on top of that, there's a huge gap between the level of ambition in the circular economy strategy, which is good. We do want a circular economy in Scotland, and these policies that are being presented to achieve that ambition. It's not clear how these policies will meet that ambition, and a lot of these policies are existing policies, things that we've seen before, and we've seen decades of these policies not working as well as expected. So how can the Scottish Government expect the same policies that they presented before to meet this new level of ambition without giving the details of what changes they will be making?
Right. Is there a point where, with those sector-specific roadmaps, there would be clarity as to what the carbon reduction is? You're saying it's difficult at the moment to say, within this broad suite of policies, we might get somewhere to what the envelope should be within the climate change plan for waste. But is there a point where, in the next year or two to come, you would expect more detail coming forward as to exactly what will be achieved?
We very much hope to see that, of course, and I think this is one of the problems with taking just a territorial approach, in that many of these policies, the impacts will be broader than that. So without a plan to introduce some level of thinking around consumption emissions reporting, it's going to be very difficult to show the benefits of these policies.
Yeah, okay. It's kind of like a blind spot, isn't it? The consumption side of things. Duncan.
The easiest answer to give in the first instance is the devil will be in the detail of what comes out. If you asked me to pick EPR, product stewardship, materials, I would pick textiles, clothing. I would include mattresses within that, carpets. If you ask me for a material specific, I would say plastics. We need to have a strategy for managing plastics. Waste electricals and electronics, we already have an EPR scheme for, but knowing more about that, potentially introducing reuse around that. All of these things are pointed at and said that they're ways forward, but they often take a lot of negotiation with industry, take a lot of time to put in place. The benefit you get is a greater granularity and accuracy of data. So in terms of, say, packaging EPR, we have much more data on packaging that's reliable than we do, for example, on mattresses or other types of material. So they do give you levers to move. And I think if some of the policies that are being talked about, for example, similar policies to they have in France, where you're not allowed to destroy returned goods, you can immediately see a benefit in carbon of saying, well, if all this stuff comes back from online buying and our decision is to destroy it rather than reuse it and put it on the market again, then there's obviously an increased carbon benefit. How much will we know? Only once the policy's in place and see how much is there. So I think my view would be it's generally in the right direction. I can understand why there's a sensitivity, as we heard in the transport discussion, to not give firm commitments to push forward at a greater speed of time. I would love to have seen it push forward at a greater speed of time. And I think the key to this, and what our RMMS members would like to see, is a much faster and much more planned way of moving from policy to operationalisation of the policy at the ground level, getting that to happen faster.
But is that possible to articulate in a climate change plan, or is it something
very
that...
difficult to do because you're dependent upon so many other stakeholders and actors moving forward with your policy and agreeing to the way it is. So I think overall the direction is correct. Could it be a bit more ambitious? Probably yes, but has it taken consideration of all of the back outcomes of COVID, war in Ukraine, inflation and these issues? To me, the balance is there. What it's the key to delivering it is getting it delivered more efficiently going forward.
Okay. Lucy, do you want to come in? That's you on.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was over enthusiastic and tried to unmute myself there, not realising that it had to be done for me. I think to come back to the original question about the connection between the two, there's obviously connections between the two and overriding things that cross over. And I think one of the things that the way that waste management is depicted within the climate change plan actually reinforces some of the need for some of the direction of the circular economy strategy. So particularly the emphasis on data and particularly the emphasis on skills and education. Although, like others have said, those could definitely be fleshed out within the circular economy strategy. They're quite broad brush at the moment. And I think having more concrete articulations of those things that are really broad is really important, because it's really hard to identify. The transparency, if you like, is very difficult of what the policy is actually going to do. And so whilst we might name things like producer responsibility and deposit return schemes, there are multiple ways in which these things can come into the fore. So it's not really giving people the certainty or the direction of travel as to what's going to happen here. And we also don't really have the data to be able to predict how that might be taken forward, and to say what the most sensible solution or direction would be, I think. So both the climate change plan and the circular economy strategy, I think, could benefit, and I think it's been said not just by me, but certainly by me already, from a little bit more specificity on what it actually means by these policy
Thank you.
Directions.
Thanks. Gary?
And I think the link is explicit between the climate change plan and the circular economy strategy. And actually we welcome that. I think with some exceptions, plastics being an example where we maybe need a bit more detail. With some exceptions, I think the circular economy strategy sets out the right set of actions. Yes, there's more detail to come in terms of what choices we make about materials we pick and how we deliver. But I think, broadly speaking, it's the right set of actions. And actually, what we're really keen to see is to see us transition from making plans and policies and getting on with the delivery side of things. You know, Kevin Stewart referred to it in the previous session on the transport chapter. I think in terms of the waste management chapter, we're all quite keen to get on with the delivery aspect of that as well now.
Yeah. Ian, finally, back to you.
Yeah, sorry. I guess I'm hesitating. Obviously, I declare a conflict of interest in terms of the circular economy strategy. In my previous role at Zero Waste Scotland, I oversaw, that was one of our specific roles at Zero Waste Scotland, was to help and support the development of that strategy. So it just feels awkward for me to, to talk about it other than to support it. It sets out exactly what I talked about at the beginning in terms of where we are as a country in terms of our ambition. It very much, I mean, it's for me, it's the fuller picture. It is about consumption emissions. It's about addressing the wider climate impacts of our economy, both here in Scotland and abroad, rather where the climate plan, as we've talked about, is very much about our territorial emissions. So it is a bigger picture, and it is very much seeing what we're now talking about, waste or resources, from an economic point of view and from a social point of view, and from a future economic story for Scotland. That's where we should be going. I believe the delivery of the circular economy strategy ambition for Scotland will deliver our climate ambitions in totality. Those are not even being addressed at this moment in time within the climate plan. I absolutely believe that. Yes, it's out for consultation. Yes, it's a good opportunity for others to feed into that as much as for government and for Zero Waste Scotland to set the agenda, and we welcome that. But I do think the strategy deals with a lot of the issues that we're talking about in terms of climate, and goes further than simply thinking about the waste management options that we're facing at this moment in time, which, to be fair, that's what the climate plan is all about. There's a challenge around landfill. We need to get out of landfill because of the methane, etc., and we need to get more material out of the residuals so it doesn't end up in energy from waste, because this carbon intensity of materials in there are causing further emissions. That's the reality. That's what the climate plan is really about. That, not what's in the circular economy strategy. So it is aligned, but it's looking at it from two different points of view.
Do you think the co-benefits then to that more resource-efficient society, is that adequately reflected in the climate change plan, or is the climate change plan really just focusing on potential policies to cut carbon without thinking about the wider kind of...
I think it's reflected. I mean, as I said at the beginning, there's acknowledgement in the plan. In the annexes, it talks about consumption. It talks about, acknowledges the fact that to some extent, the plan is about territorial emissions and not about consumption. But that's the legal framework that you are all operating within. So I'm not saying it's wrong. You've been asked to look at a plan that is going to reduce carbon emissions at a territorial level, and waste management does incur those things. So I'm not, but that's where we are.
Yeah.
But the good news is that we have something over here called the circular economy ambition and strategy and bill that is acknowledging that itself. It's not just, with every respect, me saying that. You're now saying that. We have something else that is going to take us further and go beyond the territorial emissions. And yes, that might feel that it's at the starting point and we haven't got all of the answers laid out in all of the detail, but we have a strategy, we have a bill, an act, sorry. We have an act, we have a strategy, and we have a lot more people at the table in different sectors, the sector roadmaps we talked about, a broader church of stakeholders involved in this, and momentum, and that's not just Scotland. There is global momentum around this approach. So, that's okay. the good news.
Okay, thanks.
I think Lucy wanted to come in briefly. Did you, Lucy?
Yeah, just very briefly. We talk a lot about sector approaches and sector roadmaps in the circular economy discourse, but also in I think, carbon reduction terms. And perhaps one of the things that I would observe from both policies is the drive for material sectors. And actually, if we want to achieve some of the transformational ambitions, then we need to look at the sectors that are central for delivery. So the cross-cutting sectors as well. So things like finance, for example. And the way that the climate plan is presented by looking at waste management and particularly the number of jobs. That was the thing that really was highlighted to me, I think, in the plan, where it said there's 12,000 people work in the waste management sector. What we need is not just 12,000 or 80,000, whatever it says for circular economy. There's much, much more involvement in Scotland needed to have this transformation in the delivery of the route map. And so those job numbers need to expand, not in terms of new jobs, but in terms of the responsibilities of different jobs and different sectors in delivering the things that are needed for the particular material sector's ambitions.
Thank you. The next questions come from the Deputy Convener, Michael.
Good morning. I want to maybe just look at the issue of procurement policy, because obviously the circular economy strategy is an important part of the draft climate change plan and being able to achieve its ambitions in reducing emissions from waste. And I'd be interested in getting your views on how we could adapt or change our existing public procurement policy in a way which would help to strengthen the circular economy in order to support its development, and whether there are specific measures that could be taken in order to help to support that. If I maybe just give you one example and evidence that we've received from Highland Council, where they've said in their evidence to the committee is that the Scottish Government should mandate minimum recycling content in public procurement. Now, of course, if you were to do that across the public sector, it would actually potentially be quite transformational. And actually, I think building on the point that Ian was making is that actually if you do it the right way economically, it could also actually be beneficial as well if you target the right areas. I wonder if I could get your views on whether you think there is a role for public procurement policy and specific measures within it that you would like to see happening in order to help to support the circular economy and drive greater use of recycled goods. Duncan.
Yes, absolutely. I would love to see changes in public procurement. I think there have been an amount of changes muted and put into place. Getting it to happen in practice has been a bit harder. I think your example is very good. I think there are other measures, social value. So I've seen people measuring the benefit of, for example, providing refurbished, repaired laptops to give people who would not have access to that type of technology or access to the internet, access to education and information. There's obviously a measure there. We already do measure a part of that, but what we don't give is a financial benefit. And I think that links back to your, say, recycled content. I think there are a number of strands here. It's worthwhile the committee understanding that the European Union is going to introduce mandatory recycled content targets on packaging materials. If we don't do that, what will happen is we'll collect the material and it will disappear to mainland Europe because that's where the incentive is for those goods to go. We have a packaging plastic tax where you require to put in a minimum level of recycled content or you pay a tax, but I don't think I'm speaking out of turn on behalf of, say, the industry that manufactures the goods to say they're not so sure it's well regulated. They're not so sure that everyone is complying with that, but you're absolutely correct. If that policy of here's a recycled minimum content requirement and a public procurement driver that creates demand, we therefore have many more market factors in the form of carrots that make it more likely that the plastic industry in Scotland, domestic reprocessing, could be improved. So, and that goes for recycled content aggregate, it goes for a whole number of materials that could be generated by the industry, part of the circular economy. But it's looking at that other area, maybe another area to look at, and I know this is complex legally, but if someone did work in Scotland that created a material that lasted longer, created a high-quality recycled content or an alternative to a virgin material, then that is the equivalent of a carbon inset. So therefore, why can't the public body claim it against their net carbon zero target in Scotland, as opposed to potentially saying, and I'm not suggesting it's not a good thing to do, but as opposed to planting trees somewhere or funding a hydroelectric system in some other part of the world, why don't we measure it more directly here? And that might get back to Kim's aspiration of a real joining of carbon measurement to this decision here benefited this carbon sink here, rather than it having a negative impact in this country where it used to come from before.
Yeah. Okay. Ian.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Totally agree. I mean, procurement is a massive opportunity to leverage more circularity. I think everybody recognises that. And we need to help and support procurement colleagues, both at national level, local government, public sector, but also within businesses more generally, to understand that, yeah, by adapting different strategies in their procurement, they could create the market pool for circular business models, whether that's recycled materials, you said, but even more, thinking about products for reuse, remanufacturing on an ongoing basis, changing the kind of life cycle assessment of that, so they're not buying cheap. That's it. I mean, we need to be doing that, but we need to be supporting the procurement world to do that, to evidence it, and forgive me, I mean, I was involved in, many years ago, we're in a different role, at that time it was called public social partnerships, which again was changing public procurement for social outcomes. And there's lots of examples now of how social criteria being put into public sector contracts, or right across the public sector now. I'm trying to remember how many years ago that was, but that was driven by piloting things, taking opportunities out and piloting examples of where you could demonstrate that could work. That through local government, obviously funded by European funding at the time. But by doing that and creating the evidence and to some extent encouraging public procurement professionals to look at their procurement in a different way, they could deliver multiple outcomes for not just their immediate community but at a national level as well. That's the type of thing we should be thinking about in this space. How do we create opportunities to demonstrate the value of procurement, changes in procurement, the way we do it. But it is about thinking about the whole system. I know I've probably said this before in this very chamber, even just thinking about NHS is a massive opportunity because they have a huge demand for materials made from plastic, and they also dispose of huge amounts of plastic at the end of life. They could create a market for some of those plastic opportunities we've been talking about, when we talk about the circular economy. But it's just, and that's not NHS. They need help to support how do you create that system, putting the remanufacturing, the repurposing of the products in here in Scotland at a level that we can demonstrate value. And then, okay, somebody might have to spend a little bit more, somebody in the procurement chain might have to spend a little bit more than they're spending now, which again is the barrier. But ultimately, the benefits, as we questioned right at the beginning, the benefits are felt through the supply chain. It might actually be a factory or reprocessing infrastructure. Duncan's already mentioned the PET bottles, something that happens in Scotland in a local economy that creates 150, 200 jobs in supply chains. That's where we need to get to now. We need to start thinking about the whole supply chain and the economic benefit, both, yes, at a national level, but also at a local level, because some of these opportunities can be delivered at a local level now. And that's not just thinking about the Central Belt. They could be delivered in Inverness, they could be delivered in the south of Scotland, they could be delivered at scale that really matters to those supply chains. But it needs, I mean, I use the word creativity. It just needs people around the table to start thinking differently and be given the support and to some extent the space to almost step out of the rules, the kind of constrained rules of procurement to some extent, and test those ideas, and then to model them, and then to be able to come back and say, we've got the evidence, we can make a difference here.
And would for example, as was suggested by Helen Council, a mandate for a minimum recycled content in public procurement be the type of, would that give a green light to the sector to say, look, we expect you to push into that area and we want to see innovation and opportunities being created in doing that? Yes,
I mean, something like that. I mean, obviously, it depends on the material, because ultimately we want to make sure that that's a material asset that we have in our economy coming out, so it's being driven. We're not just going to
not want to import stuff for the purpose of doing it.
Somewhere else. Yeah. And there is an example, I'm trying to remember again, right at the beginning of my career, there was such a thing in buildings, construction waste. There had to be a minimum recycled content. I think it was about 10%, I think, at the time. And people said, we're never going to be able to achieve that. But that did drive a huge amount of basically reprocessing of aggregate when buildings were being deconstructed in the economy, because there was then a market for that. Obviously, cost associated with getting rid of that material helped as well. So, yeah, absolutely, these things are for targeted and specific things. And again, going back to not just thinking of it from a waste point of view, but thinking of it from an economic point of view, where are the materials that we really need? The paper talks about critical raw materials, lithium, copper, all those things. How do we get those materials, start focusing on the ones that we have in our waste stream and we need in our economy? How do we then start to bring all those people together? And you're right, putting minimum levels in procurement rules, or whatever we want to call them, absolutely will help.
Yeah, also if it's targeted in such a way as that you're producing products from it that actually help to reduce our carbon footprint as well, which have that wider environmental benefit.
Absolutely, but it is about looking at the system, and I'm going to indulge me again. You know, I remember way before DRS, you know, was talked about. You know, I remember being at a dinner with a cabinet secretary at the time, who was arguing about something very similar on plastics. So going back to PET, you know, putting a minimum pricing of a minimum level of 50% PET. And there was a table of a number of brands, etc., at the dinner. And at that time, they said, yeah, we could do that, but we won't be using the plastic from Scotland. We'll go and get it from somewhere else, and we'll bring it in, and we'll put it, you know. So technically, it can be done, but unless we actually think about the whole system, then yes, we achieve something, but we're still going to be disposing of our plastics because the infrastructure that we've got to collect, separate, and process it isn't available to us. So the plastic will be taken, you know, offshore somewhere else. Somebody else will get the economic benefit and be shipped back. Now, I know that's probably 15, 20 years ago, and things have changed, but I use that to illustrate, unless we get the system, we think about what we want to do at both ends, but then we think about how do we align the system and incentivise the system to make sure that we get all of those benefits. Because ultimately what we're doing is just setting an arbitrary target which could be delivered, you know, with unintended consequences that, not saying other people shouldn't benefit, but we lose the benefit and we're still left with the waste stream and we're still having to dispose of it.
Kim, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, so there is a huge opportunity around public procurement here for Scotland to play its role as a good global citizen. So we know that many of the supply chains for the materials that we're using in Scotland have serious and extensive impacts associated with them, both environmental and in terms of human rights abuses as well. So we have to be thinking about how do we reduce our demand for these materials in particular, and public procurement can play a huge role in that. So we could see what's known as human rights and environmental due diligence standards set up for public procurement in Scotland, and that could be leading the way for guidance for businesses around creating more sustainable and fairer supply chains for everybody, and Scotland could be leading the way on that. It's also a requirement of the Circular Economy Act that Scotland thinks about the international impacts of its supply chains, and the UK and the EU are also moving to think about this as well, so it would be aligning with those plans as well. And another kind of benefit of taking this approach is that it forces us to think about exactly what materials we're using and how we can reduce the demand for those materials, like the ones that Ian has already mentioned, things like lithium and nickel and cobalt, these materials that are have a huge demand associated with them, not just in Scotland, but across the world, and which there is very limited supply. It is an unaccounted risk, not just in the circular economy section of the climate change plan, but across the whole plan, that we do not consider the materials needed to build the infrastructures that we need. So things like transport rely heavily on increasing the amount of lithium that we're going to need. But there is no plan for how we're going to get these materials. Scotland really needs a critical mineral strategy. The UK has one, but Scotland doesn't. So we need to be thinking more about how do we use these materials sensibly, how do we use them more efficiently, so that we're not creating a risk for ourselves further down the line where we're not able to meet transport goals, energy goals, because the materials aren't there to build the infrastructures that we need.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Okay, I'm just saying that always the enemy of a good committee meeting is not the convener, it's the clock. And I'm just sort of bearing in mind that my clock is ticking as far as the committee is concerned, because we've got a report that we've got to get out today as well. So short answers with short questions, always helpful. And I apologise if I shut you down, Ian, as I just have, not allowing you in. But Monica's got the next question, and I'm sure she'll let you in.
Thank you, Convener. So I have a few questions, and obviously want to hear from as many people as possible, but don't feel you have to answer the question. So my first question is going to be about reuse and repair. So perhaps we'll start with Lucy, if you want to come in, and I can go along the table. Just if you want to pass, that's fine, because we are looking at the clock. So reuse and repair economy has been mentioned a few times already today. I'm interested to hear from you if the policies in the draft plan are appropriate and clear enough in terms of developing infrastructure and the public and business engagement that we need in the reuse and repair economy. If I can start with Lucy, and I'll come along the table. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Monica. One of the things that I think is missing, and partly it's quite hard to put in the plan, but it partly comes back to my thoughts on the first question, or the second question about the costs and the benefits. The costs of reuse and repair are often felt in terms of labour. So there's a lot of labour involved in reuse and repair. And as yet in Scotland, we've not found a way in which to support that labour in a way that is economically viable for scaling it up. So we see excellent work on reuse and repair happening in local communities, very often relying on either low-paid labour or voluntary labour, and it's hugely skilled work. And yet somehow we've not managed to, and then we can't scale it up without recognising the value of that labour within the economy. And what we often see when we're talking about changes to consumption patterns is that labour being shifted to the home, and then there being additional labour required within the home, which then is again not costed. And that can also have other implications for inclusivity, because different people are taking on different aspects of that labour. So one of the things I think that would be helpful in reuse and repair is getting targets, having more data, understanding really what happens within reuse and repair within Scotland. Other countries have targets for reuse and repair. Ireland, for example, although perhaps maybe not the best, it's a starting point, let's say, rather than a full ambition. And other countries are trying to understand how reuse and repair works across different places and locations. And I think we could do more of that within Scotland to allow us to really support reuse and repair in a really proactive way. Because at the moment, coming back to, I think, what was said in the previous panel about transport, very often reuse and repair is occurring supported year on year. It's very it's unstable, the finance support for it. It's done on the goodwill of individuals and the passion of individuals, and that's absolutely brilliant. But I'm not sure it's long-term sustainable for those individuals or for reuse and repair in Scotland. So it needs to have more long-term, stable support in order to be able to scale up the excellent reuse and repair that we're currently seeing spotted around the country. And just to come back to the procurement question as well, I would really like to see reuse put into procurement as a target, as well as 20% recycling. Or instead of recycling, I think we could think very carefully about how reuse is encouraged within targets, because what we know from reuse is it does tend to stay within Scotland. So the materials tend to be within Scotland, so the social value is increased from reuse. I don't know if that counted as short, I'm sorry, but I will stop there and allow you to...
That's really helpful, thank you, Lucy. And if others agree on some of these barriers and what we need to do to scale up, then I'd be interested to hear, what targets, if you agree on targets, what those targets should be. But if I can now just start with Ian and move along the table, thank you.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with everything that's been said. And yeah, I mean, So I guess when we talk about reuse and repair, we tend to talk about it at that community level stuff. So obviously there's a lot of reuse, repair, refurbishment happening within industry as well. I think there's industry itself will work that through, particularly even thinking about the work in renewables and stuff like that. There's a lot more happening. Probably it's still these are new industries and they're getting their heads around some of this stuff. But we're seeing a lot with the INMIS, the National Manufacturing Institute in Glasgow is very much helping individual business look at how they can put reuse and refurbishment into quite significantly complex components in terms of industry. So there is stuff happening. Again, that needs support and it needs the right conditions for that to happen. But there's drivers out there because of material, critical raw material accessibility, price, the fact that it's much more innovation and technology. But in terms of the community level, absolutely, there is a lot more happening than we probably give it credit. It's sometimes not as obvious to people that these services are available. And again, yeah, I definitely think it needs more support. It needs, whether it's in procurement policy or otherwise, but a lot of it is to do with accessibility, and having these organisations more visible to us all. With every respect, we live in a very frictionless, convenient society. We want things at our fingertips. We want things, we can get new stuff delivered to our door, and we can send it back if we don't like it, instantly. We need that type of approach for reuse and repair. So again, it is quite interesting listening to that conversation in transport, because the thing that caught my attention was the professor from London talking about cargo hubs, cargo bike hubs, underneath Waterloo Station or something like that. That's the type of infrastructure whether it's local government or national government or others, that should be supporting that type of infrastructure to support reuse and repair, the availability, the accessibility of it to multiple citizens at different levels. That's what we should be thinking about. We all, the library is a hallmark of our high streets. Has been since I was a lad, and for centuries to some extent. That's the type of availability we need for reuse and repair. That type of infrastructure, and we can talk about money and value and the economic system that supports it, but a lot of it is about the availability of the infrastructure to support it on the long term.
So I think we can all think of community examples.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about Revolve Recycle in Lanarkshire. My mum's very big fan of the sewing class and some of the craft-based activities. But again, it's very volunteer-led, and a lot of these skills are seen as something that people do in their spare time or in retirement. So I just wonder about the education piece around this, particularly when you're talking about manufacturing. But I suppose, Ian, my direct question is, does the plan need to do more if we're going to have these kind of hubs in every community? Does the plan need to help drive that?
So again, sorry to repeat myself, so that bit, these policy things that we're talking about are in the circular economy strategy. That's where they sit. There's a programme of activity that sits behind that. All of the things that Lucy's talked about, that's the ambition in that plan. And as an organisation working in Zero Waste Scotland, so you could say they're there, but they're not explicit in the climate plan, because the climate plan recognises that we need to do more of that. But to get the targets in the climate plan, we just need to get biodegradable waste out of landfill, and we need to reduce the plastics going to energy from waste.
Okay, so I think we'd all like to see, well, I would,
absolutely, I totally
all
agree.
These different
So
strategies.
So
that's great.
When we get into the circular economy strategy, whatever you'll be looking at that when that comes to you, that's where I think that's where the delivery of that part of the strategy should be the focal point.
Okay, I'm trying to hold back more detailed questions. I want to just get this main question across to everyone so we can get on the record your main recommendations in terms of infrastructure around reuse and repair economy and how we expand public and business engagement. So I'll come to Kim.
Yes, so on the reuse question, so this is an incredibly important part of delivering on circular economy, and everybody in Scotland should have access to reuse and repair services. It should be as easy to repair something and reuse something as it is to buy something new. And in order to create that kind of environment, we need a huge amount of investment in reuse and repair, and that has to be sustained. One way to do that is to create that long-term ambition is to have reuse targets. And in terms of the investment, we could be seeing some of the money around EPR being ring-fenced for reuse. And I think it's really important to remember that there are different types of reuse, and in particular, we should be thinking about how do we support the third sector, so those small community groups, to flourish as much as possible, because it's these groups that have huge social benefits, especially for their local communities. So how do we make sure that we maximise these opportunities as well? And at the moment, the climate change plan, we will not see these benefits being recorded in the plan as it is at the moment. And I have made this point before about consumption emissions, but the way the emissions in the plan are, we won't see these benefits being recorded, but we can see that drive and set that driver if we have consumption-based emissions as a target as well.
Thank you. Duncan, do you have anything to add?
Yes, slightly controversial. I absolutely agree that Circular Communities Scotland and the community groups provide incredible social value. My observation is, because of the nature of the organisation, they struggle with financing, and they're also dependent normally upon one or two key individuals, especially if it's in that repair area, reuse area. And if that person retires or leaves, then there's a gap in terms of the skill being there. My opinion would be, and I think it is, and Ian can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's suggestions or research happening under the circular economy plan that there would be potential look at hubs. I would suggest 3 regional hubs, one in the west, one in the east, one somewhere heading north. Certainly around electronics, there are companies out there that already do this at scale. Close to your area, CCL North is well worth going to visit. They do an enormous amount of reuse and repair. They don't talk about it a great deal because they see it as just the job that they do, but they create many apprenticeships as well within that, so that's training skills, putting those back into the community. Gap Alba has just recently opened in Glenfarg near Perth, but in their Tyneside plant they have a sister business, Gap Renew. They're using AI technology on returned goods, which is a high-quality supply. It's not trying to find the good pieces within the household waste recycling centres. It's at-volume consumer returns. They plug it into AI. The AI says, this machine, this part will cost this amount of time, this amount of labour to repair, therefore it's worthwhile doing. This part is unavailable, or this will take you many more hours than the value in the inherent unit to do. They create an inventory stock, they take a 3D photograph, they put it online, they sell straight back into the market, which is the most accessible form of reuse you can have, whether you know it's reuse or not. And they also supply the social enterprises in their area for home starter packs and other kits. So I think regional hubs with embedded skills that can train apprentices who can then go out into the community and repair, provide supply chain through those return systems for waste electrical electronics, building and construction materials. We already have people involved in that, Brewster Brothers, Murdochs and others. And I also think some other niche sort of areas which Ian will be more aware of with work that Zero Waste has done. For example, offshore decommissioning. There is a big industry at the back of that looks at refurbishing that technical kit to put it to oil works in Africa or oil works in the Southeast Asia, but it's come from Aberdeen and offshore in the North Sea. So all of these hubs work to drive that level of economy at scale, and they're not mutually exclusive of the social enterprise area either.
No, thank you, Duncan, for those examples. I think it, again, emphasises the huge opportunities. I suppose for us as a committee, we'll have to think about the recommendations that we will make to the Government and Parliament about the plan and where it can be clearer and stronger. Last but not least, Gary, do you want to say anything on that?
I'll try not to repeat what's previously been said. So, yep, it is an important area. Extending product lifetimes and keeping materials in circulations helps tackle not just our own territorial emissions, but also the emissions involved with the replacement of products. So back at the manufacturing point as well. So that's really important. Stronger right to repair rules, fiscal incentives for repair over replacement, support for reuse, repair, local repair and reuse infrastructure, things that have been mentioned, all important. Producer responsibility, Kim touched upon. I think also using producer responsibility schemes to favour products that are genuinely designed to last and that are capable of repair in a longer life. On an additional point, a note of caution probably on the discussion around targets. So unlike waste, where we have a fairly good data set, most reuse tends to happen outside of the waste system. So data is kind of sparse. It's difficult to understand just how much repair and reuse is actually going on. So quantifying that can be quite technically challenging. So what we'd favour is, before we set targets on repair and reuse, is a stronger evidence base. So understanding what is actually going on there, out there in society, but also what the true potential is. So just a note of caution around jumping to setting targets.
Thank you, Gary. That's helpful.
Monica, just before you go on to your questions, that I can tell you there's exactly 12 minutes left before I'm closing down this session. So, Monica, I can give you 2 of those minutes, and I'm going to give 5 to Bob and 5 to Douglas for their questions. I think that's fair. So, can you use your 2 minutes as you see fit?
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask about the forthcoming product stewardship plan. We know it's expected to identify priority problem products and the policy levers to tackle them, and the plan suggests that the initial focus may be on textiles and mattresses. So I wanted to hear from maybe 1 or 2 of you, how can the Scottish Government roll out product stewardship in the most effective way in this climate change plan period, and where will UK-wide collaboration likely be needed? Who's the best person to answer this?
1 minute.
There's already been a clothing route map worked through with RAP for a UK level. The industry is saying we would like EPR, which is quite a strange thing for industry to come forward and say, give us EPR, but rules make them do things altogether rather than some front leaders do it. And also Zero Waste Scotland and others have done quite a lot of work in this area. And I also believe that there has been work done by Zero Waste Scotland on mattresses. It would be relatively straightforward to put in an EPR system for that. The thing that takes the longest time is negotiating with industry what the solution is. So the start's been done. If I was being horrible, I would say, let's get on and do it.
Briefly, we can take Gary and Kim, just very
No, you can take one.
One. Gary?
Very quickly, your reference to kind of the UK kind of policy environment, that is probably quite important, because the market operates on a UK-wide, if not an international basis. So that we can set our own priorities, and we need to be really clear about doing that. But yes, partnership and working there would be useful.
Is that me out of time?
That's you out of time. I'm sorry, Monica, and I'm sorry, Kim, but I've got to be fair to Bob and Douglas. Bob, 5 minutes.
Direct this question to Ian in the first instance, and I think +1. You can, as I speak to Ian, you can work out if that you're the best place to answer it, our fellow witnesses. I want to ask about the Recycling Improvement Fund. Glasgow's benefited greatly, £21 million. I won't give details of that. Hopefully it will make a step change in Glasgow's recycling rates. The fund's nearly spent. Ian, has it been a success? And what should the priority be for the remainder of that fund to really change how local authorities are doing in terms of recycling and diverting waste from landfill to be processed in Scotland for gasification or other uses?
So the quick answer is, so all of the money that's been allocated to it has now been spent. So there isn't any, or it has been committed. So there's no additional money in the Recycling Improvement Fund. That was a 5-year programme. It's come to an end.
So what should the next steps be then, Ian? My notes said, I didn't realise that. My notes don't confirm that, but that's helpful. Let's play a game here. £20 million appears. what should the priority be for that?
So, well, it did demonstrate that there is certainly an appetite for local authorities to improve or expand their services, both geographical reach and into new materials and into different socio-economic groups in terms of housing types and stuff like that. So there's definitely an appetite. So if there was more money, yes, you would see more investment in infrastructure. I definitely think there's probably more that could be done in, again, reuse and repair. You know, that, although it's called the Recycling Improvement Fund, it did, the scope did cover reuse and repair opportunities, and there was a few bids, successful bids, into the fund for that. I think we could, go back to the previous point, some of that money could be used to support that type of infrastructure that's already been mentioned.
So I may squeeze out some of your colleagues by coming back in, and Kim will take you as the second person to volunteer here. But can I just check, earlier you spoke about we need the capacity to process all this stuff.
Yeah,
that was separate from...
So that's the challenge. So again, this is the thing about systems. So that's a fund to fund local authority collection infrastructure. It did not. So going back to an earlier point, it pushed more materials out, but there wasn't a fund that sat there and said, right, what do we do with those materials here in Scotland? So whether that's investing in PET recycling or, you know, whatever type of material that's coming out, that's where we need a different approach. We need to look at the whole system and say, well, we're going to target that material, going back to Kim's point about copper, lithium, whatever it is, batteries, you know, small electronic equipment, target that at curbside, get that stuff out and then invest, find money from another source potentially to invest in infrastructure that's going to support the reprocessing of that here in Scotland and then tie it into public procurement. That's us looking at different pots of money in a system-wide. That would be my approach going forward. Yes, we can take more, we can invest in more bins, boxes and trucks on the road to take stuff out, but we're not looking at the other stuff. At the other end of this, with every respect, we're putting it in a container and we're probably sending it off to another part of the world.
Thank you. I agree with all that. I'm sorry this wasn't a discussion, but it was always like a speed dating question in every session. Kim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the real test of whether this fund has been a success or not is Scotland's recycling rates. And we've seen that Scotland's recycling rates have not improved for over a decade now. And one kind of example of how this fund has been used is the soft plastics recycling plant in Fife that went into administration 7 months after it opened with no kind of clear explanation as why that happened. So I would say that these funds are not being used very well at the moment. And one of the huge risks around recycling in Scotland is the fact that we've seen this big increase in incineration. If we're burning waste, it means that it's not there to be recycled. So this is going to be a huge problem for Scotland going forwards if it wants to increase its recycling rates.
Okay. Sorry, Gary, you can take a bid for my final question if the Queen's given me time for that. Well, I'll ask the question and people can roll their eyes. They don't get a chance to come in. I apologise. So, key commitments in recycling include the new statutory code of practice expected in 2026, and we're looking through the circular economy bill. What practical changes will need to be made to support the waste management sector to be more consistent across Scotland in relation to the regimes across 32 local authorities, which, after all, is what the code of practice is supposed to secure, that no authority is left behind and there's a consistency there in relation to recycling. There was much more in the question than that, Convener, but I don't have time to ask any more, and I feel it's all a bit rushed, to be honest. Gary,
well, does somebody want to give an answer on that? One person.
Probably not the best place to answer the question. So Zero Waste Scotland are working with the local authorities on the co-design of that household waste recycling plan. So that's probably where the answer would best come from, I think.
Gary, it's actually half a question because of the time, quite frankly, we've got left today. I wish to comment on that. It's all far from satisfactory.
If you were going to spend money and on the code of practice, the best thing that you could spend it on would be clear communication to the household who hasn't been communicated to in a great deal of time about their new system, how to use it and get the most from it and where the benefit from the materials comes from. And the EPR system will put a lot of money into a national conversation on that. And I think at Glasgow level, the more Glasgow knows about Glasgow's waste and what people do with their system, it will get you better quality at the back end.
Finish, Convener, my apologies for the dreadfully rushed questioning there. Yeah.
And my apologies too, Douglas.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just got a question for Gary, first of all. Gary SEPA have said it would not fully enforce the landfill ban on biodegradable waste until 2028. But I think the government seems to have baked the landfill ban from the end of 2025. So does that not make the figures that they are presenting, are they still credible?
So I think the figures are still credible, particularly if you're looking at this in terms of the 4 to 5 year phases in terms of the delivery of the plan and the emissions. We certainly remain focused on the delivery of the ban. The impact of us not extending taking that regulatory position that we've taken, the impact of us not taking that would have been carbon emissions probably in other territories, so in England, for example, landfilling, and additional transport carbon costs associated with that as well. So it does push back the achievement of those targets by up to 2 years, but that's still, I think, within the kind of window and the time frame set out within the plan, and still in terms of the Climate Change Committee's recommendations, we can still deliver those emission reductions by 2028.
But I'm struggling to understand how could that carbon savings be made if there is still waste going to biodegradable waste going to landfill?
So it won't be made. So the remaining gap is about, to our estimates, opinions vary on what the actual gap is in terms of residual waste capacity. Our estimate puts it at about 300,000 tonnes per annum. So you're looking potentially at 300,000 tonnes per annum for the next 2 years, still going to landfill, still potentially associated emissions with that, but that will close off in 2028.
Yeah, but it'll be 2 years before that happens. Did you, in terms of, because obviously you'd made that announcement before the government released this plan, did you have discussions with the government before that, so they were aware of what they were putting in the plan that wouldn't be achievable because of you were not enforcing that ban for 2 years?
I'm not sure of the timing of their drafting versus the conversations, but there were certainly conversations, Zero Waste Scotland, Scottish Government, ourselves and industry as well. So that was obvious to everybody as part of those conversations which took place over the last 6 months in the lead up to that announcement by SEPA.
Okay, I'd like to dig into that further, but obviously no time. Next question was around energy from waste. Are there assumptions made across this plan on energy from waste? Are they credible, achievable? And I'm thinking things like carbon capture and storage. Do you think, and maybe I'll ask Duncan this first of all, do you think the carbon capture storage assumptions made around energy from waste can be achieved?
I think that the technology is emerging and there is a capability to do it. I think it's harder to achieve than many people think, but I also think that the industry and government itself is working to say we will try to reduce the emissions coming through energy from waste from ETS and from these other drivers where they're saying we'll charge you for high carbon material going into energy from waste. What's important is that we work with government, industry and other bodies to say that the alternatives in the interim are put in place. The capacity for energy from waste is there or thereabouts in Scotland, but there will be a need for it. ETS means we should be focusing on getting those plants to work well, linked into the grid, linked into heat networks, linked into carbon capture. But ahead of that, we should also have plans for dealing with plastic and other high carbon materials to remove them before local authorities and others pick up the cost.
But is the technology there just now to do the CCS?
I personally do not believe that it is.
Kim, I'll maybe come to you.
No, you won't. I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry, Douglas, and I apologise. And if I was sitting around this table as a committee member and as those people giving evidence, I'd be disappointed that I've got to end the meeting there. But I have no option. We are on incredibly tight timescales for all the things we do in this committee, and the climate change plan is perhaps the biggest example of that we've only got till the end of February to do it, and all our other business. So I'd like to thank those people giving evidence this morning for their time and for the details that they've given. I'd like to apologise to you as convener that we haven't got enough time to get all the answers. And I'd also apologise to committee members for cutting them short. But we have got a report to see through straight after this. So we'll now move the meeting into private session. Thank you.